So, why don't maybe we should start actually with how what did you name TransLab at UC Santa
Yeah,
Barbara, and how would you describe the naming and how it relates to your vision of space making, let's say?
sure. That's a really good question. In terms of this business of starting with, starting pre-computer and leading now, uh, I just, was lucky or strange or whatever it was, and so I ran into the idea of design and computation that didn't quite exist. But I ran into it as an undergraduate, literally like in second or third year. And so by the time I graduated, right at, like, as soon as I graduated, I was offered a professorship uh, and to start a lab. So my entire experience has been starting different labs. So there was a design and computation lab that I started actually in the Department of Industrial Design at Ohio State, and then later at the University of Texas at Austin, we were doing things. I started something called the Reality Lab, and we were doing VR and design and computation before Jumi's famous paperless studio, like years before. And we were kind of in this space. Of course, he was at Columbia and he had a different megaphone. But it's all part of history. And so by the time I started this lab called the TransLAB, I'd already done something called uh, famously liquid architectures and then trans architectures. And I was looking for the next step, and I called it transvergence. And the trans had to do with the idea of uh, transformation that leads to speciation. So the topic was to make it architectural. When you have a site, the site has space, right? Okay, the space is already there. If you put a building on it, the space was already there and it was modified by a set of actions. And if those actions were powerful, it produced a work of architecture that was admirable and good and all of those things, which was a speciation of the space that was already there. So the question was, how do you take uh, ordinary things and make them extraordinary? Not just in form, but also in color and sound in any modality, including the virtual. So we're kind of operating at a meta level, and we're working transmodally and transdimensionally. And trans architectures itself was a kind of supercharging of the idea and the pedagogy and the practice of architecture to include more than just the built environment as we know it. Like anything can be approached architecturally, including new things. And if we open our minds to it, we can proceed architecturally to modify and make extraordinary anything that's ordinary. And you can do it with science, and you can do it with art, and you can do it with everything. So the TransLab is this space where, the way I explain to my students is that we're operating at a meta level,
Hmm.
trying to see what's extraordinary in music, let's say, and in architecture, and in art, and in philosophy, and in science, operate in a transdimensional way, meaning 4, 5, 18 dimensions, and then from there bring it down to architecture, to music, to dance, to literature, to whatever we may want to do. Because we've been working at a higher level, bringing it into the particular project is actually, it takes work and specificity, but now it's easier to do. Because you've already been operating at a meta level.
Are you writing your own software at this point, or have you been?
Inevitably, yeah. Well, we leverage, if other software does things, that we can use, we use it. Like uh, NVIDIA's Omniverse software proposal. They just gave a keynote, and Jensen Huang, who's the CEO, was explaining that it involves many companies. It involves about 1.5 million developers around the world. and the companies represented have a market value of $100 trillion. Well, clearly we're not going to compete with that. But what we're going to do is we're going to exactly figure out what they wouldn't do, and code our own connective thread. So we code, but we don't try to reinvent the things that major companies are doing. We just figure out what they wouldn't do and then know how to code the difference.
So that's just a fascinating clarification you just made. But for instance, I could see almost making a patent for that linking mechanism. Kind of a
Well,
web.
yeah, and people do. I mean, people start companies, and some of them do it open source.
Yeah.
Some of it become consultants. Some of them start companies. Our own graduates. Some of them start their own labs elsewhere. Some of them work directly in research at places like Apple and Google and so on. So and this notion of the architect again is kind of supercharged because it takes the mindset, which is very powerful and has thousands of years of development, and instead of constraining it into, well, make me apartments that bring me rent and I don't really care how they look, it says, okay, take that super mindset and apply it to new problems.
Yeah, incredible. So your first couple of responses here, your first comments are absolutely dense and loaded with ideas.
I'm quite dense. Yes, it's true.
Yes, I'm dense too, yeah.
I've been told that.
And of course, I meant dense and complimentary way. So, but in any case, to unpack it a bit, when you say trans-dimensional, for instance, I immediately started thinking string theory, and
Sure.
yeah. So, and it's fascinating the way you refer to it, because I think that there is an aspect of what we are in the midst of, this explosion. Again, you and I, in terms of our age, if there's any similarities, it's that we started. I'm 63, what have you, but I started hand drafting in the school,
Oh, yeah.
and then
vellum and ink and
right,
scraping the
that
ink
was
off, and then
the coolest
mylar,
thing.
which was a big,
Right.
yeah.
And the coolest thing we could do was to go off into our own imaginations with pen and ink. And Libeskind actually famously created those ink drawings, musical notation.
Microcosmos. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
wonderful, Cosmos. And then I think there was a set of black album cover size volumes, and they're probably rare books at this point. I have a few of those. I think Zaha put out one, etc. But in any case, where we probably, again, we both probably imagine the world going to where we are now, and we still imagine way beyond.
Yeah.
But
Right.
but what the computer is appearing to open up before our eyes is a almost literal multidimensional space. So even though string theory can only exist, my understanding of physics at this point, of astrophysics, of the world of physics and astronomy, etc. If string theory can only exist if there are 11 dimensions, apparently, there's a whole critique that we can't, we have no proof that there really are 11 dimensions. String theory is under a lot of critique now, but it's I'm for that type of thinking, and I'm supportive and open-minded in regard to it. And it seems to me that we are actually experiencing a lot of these things through the computer, like right now. We're having if not metaphors, then actual dimensional experiences. And one thought that I've had is that we have Mark Zuckerberg's version of the metaverse, but in point of fact, if there are 8 billion people on Earth, we could conceivably have 1 million metaverses of completely different creations, completely different, and then those metaverses can start interacting and contacting somebody else's metaverse, and we already have a kind of way into the infinite in terms of the creations that are happening on people's laptops and in the cloud, et cetera. So when you talk of trans-dimensional, I mean, could you go into that a little more about how you envision it and what and how you approach that word?
Well, we're told, kind of conventionally, we're told that there are three dimensions and that's it. But even in this space, as soon as you start working with sensors and devices, you realize that even to locate a point, you have the XYZ, but the point might be directed. So you would have a vector from that point saying that this point is here and pointing there, right? And you do that with something called a quaternion, which gives another 4 numbers. And now you have 7 numbers, which is effectively like 7 dimensions. And if you were also interested in the color of that point, you would have another 3. And if you were interested at the temperature at that point, then you would have another one. And if you were interested in the electric charge at that point, then you would have another one. And these are all familiar physical quantities. So the idea that the space we're in is actually 3-dimensional is just a simplification. It's like, stories for children. And in fact, it's like it's always been a much higher end dimensional. By the time you get to someone like Gerald Edelman, who was a Nobel Prize winning neuroscientist who worked on something called neural Darwinism, he claimed, and his research group continues, he claimed that consciousness is an n-dimensional space, with n being something probably bigger than 100,000, and maybe in the millions. That basically every quality that we can name is actually a dimension. You can be thought of as a dimension. Well, he wrote that decades ago, but if you actually look at what's going on with machine learning, and let's say the current craze, which is this thing called diffusion, stable diffusion is one thing that people are doing. That's how this thing in my background is made. Every pixel becomes a dimension for every image in a database of billions of images. and these are all kind of constructed into this cloud of points in this super n-dimensional space. And when you give it a prompt, which can be a verbal prompt to produce language, or it can be a verbal point to produce images, or it can be a verbal point to produce anything that you want. You basically just prompt it, and what you're doing is you're nudging meaning in this n-dimensional cloud. Now you have a cloud of possibilities, and by interacting with it, you're pushing it, in a kind of space of all the possible things, until finally it arrives at something that you recognize. I think you might be entertained by this. Okay, so I have this background here, which is obviously.
Yeah, I think I have to do multiple participants can share simultaneously.
Oh no, you don't need to share. No, you don't need to share. I'll just change my background. Okay. So this is produced this way, and it's obviously fantastic. But this is also produced in the same way, and these are easily understandable as architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they're made is, or this one, they get more and more literal, but they exist in this huge cloud of possibility. And I can coax it to do that, or I can coax it to do this, which again seems quite material.
Absolutely.
But the way I can get to it is because I actually drew things on vellum with ink.
That's great. Yeah. Well, let's hear it for hand-eye coordination.
It isn't hand-eye. No, it's conceptual. I mean, I love drawing and painting and sculpting, and I think that's part of it too. It's the extension of hands-eye coordination to this trans-dimensional space.
Yes.
It's like taking these experiences and saying, well, the space was never only three-dimensional. Even when I was making a choice to make a drawing, the line weight of something, that was already in a higher dimensional space. Just like when we make music,
Well,
the
and as
music
you
is much
said,
more than
yeah,
the note.
and you alluded to that initially too, is that in terms of this, let me see if I have the wording right, and like the end dimension of what's possible in the human brain, in the human, you know,
Yeah,
possibility of imagination, and arguably it's infinite. There's no limit.
it's effectively infinite. Like whether infinity exists or isn't is a huge philosophical question. But for creatures that are as small and as brief as we are, it doesn't have to be infinite. It just has to be bigger. You know?
Yeah, or big or beyond the immediate surface limit of our imagination in a way.
Yeah.
And don't you feel, from, I suppose, from the origin, I'm asking you, do you, maybe the appropriate way to say it is, do you feel from the origin of your imaginings about being an architect, whenever that started, that you wanted to push that limit of what was possible?
Well, I think from what I know, I think we share this next thing. When I got into architecture school, uh, I was really surprised that most people, many people, including my instructors, for the most part, didn't think that architecture was an art, and I couldn't and still can't understand it. To me, architecture is an art with everything that implies. I mean, it's a particular one, but so is every other art. Sculpture is a particular art, and music is a particular art, and everything else is. So it's not exactly the same as everyone else or everything else. But it's not just a service or a utility or a function
Yeah.
or a sort of return on investment operation. I mean, it expresses civilization itself. It's like music. It's a high form of expression. Um, and so, yeah. So let me pause there and let you advance the question. I don't know if I'm answering exactly what you were asking.
Well, no, I think that well, I'd ask it in another way. I think that we're an amazing time in human history and in the history of architecture, with tremendous possibility and also, tremendous danger. There's a lot. It's both edges of the sword, as it were. And the on one side, the the unification of all disciplines because of the computer appears to be occurring. That
Mhm.
that everybody is going to the laptop. Computation is almost evening out the communication possibilities. And there are theories. This goes into the list of questions that I have on my right here. But again, your interests and capabilities and your leadership really in this area, is art. Even though you just showed me, including the background, aspects of what you do that have material essences. In a sense, we are quickly moving towards an anti-materialistic world where we're starting to realize, and there are and leading edges of philosophy, and again physics and biology, all these different disciplines seem to be integrating with an understanding that we are, molecules with space between them, that through quantum gravity is holding me together as David and holding you together as Marcos. And that immaterial component is becoming more and more evident, for argument's sake. And so the limits of the imagination, um, I think, are coinciding with, for argument's sake, like Piranesi's drawing 300 years ago. He was almost hoping for where we are now, and yet, he was caught within stylistic limitations, and we could talk about that too. But into the sense that we are, emerging from style in a profound way, perhaps. Those are important questions. But you know, are we really at the dawn of the immaterial? And are you is that a way that you approach what you're doing, or how do you feel about materialism versus, you know, anti-materialistic philosophies? There's a lot of danger in both, I think, but I'd love
No, I understand. And I think you're using material in a couple of different ways. So materialism in one way is, well, you know, how do you fabricate architecture? Like how is it built, you know, in the kind of solid
sure.
sense, you know. But
Yeah.
materialism is also, I mean, even you know, the molecules with lots of space between them, that's still material. That's not immaterial. So let me ask, let me try this both ways. You know, that basically from physics, our situation is even stranger than that. You know, basically there are no particles. You know, the only thing that actually exists are fields,
Right.
and they're like
That's
oceans,
great.
but there are many of them. There's, you know,
Yes.
and they're interacting very selectively. And a particle is just a wave. You know, the analogy, the best analogy that I know is that, you know, you go to the ocean and there's the ocean, and under certain conditions of wind, there's foam on top of waves. The foam is a particle. For a while, you can say, there's that particle, and I can see it moving. But then it vanishes, and then another particle appears because the conditions. So those are particles. Now, we thought that the particles were actual things, and that the world was constructed of these things. But actually, they're just perturbations, and reality is made of these perturbations, right? So there's actually nothing there. Okay, so that's one kind of expanded materialism. But that's the thing is that that's still materialism in the sense that something is there. You know, I mean, it seems very strange to us, but it is there. It's detectable and computable and all of that. Um, uh, the virtual now, which to us seems immaterial, to anyone who sits down to make it, is actually supremely material. And all you need to do is to have your cat knock the power cord out of the laptop, and you see that it's material. I mean, all the virtuality just vanishes because it's all electricity and circuits and little bits of memory and very tangible things, very, very fine things, but very material things. And the code itself is written. I mean, you have to have the code. The code is actually a thing. And if you take an eraser to the code, or you scramble the words, you know, whatever the code is written in, it doesn't work. So it's not immaterial there either. But it's not immediate. You know, it's not the same as, you know, like, okay, you know, I'm running out of coffee. You know. So I don't know where that leaves your question. I mean, there are permutations from here, but that's already one pass, and we can sort of, it's a big question you've asked. So let me toss it back to you and see if we can
Well, you
if
know,
we can re-engage.
so I can argue on, you know, I just had a talk with Helmut Kinsler from Zaha Hadid Architects, who's the
Yeah.
one of the leaders of virtual reality for Zaha Hadid, and we could argue that you know, preceding Zaha's death in 2016 to where we are today, um, Zaha Hadid Architect, you know, it's a kind of think tank. They're really attempting to push the envelope of the material. but
I was
and
lucky enough to meet Zaha, and I know Patrick and many people who work there, and
Yes,
Cristiano. You know, so you know, that's what's nice about them. I mean, they're in the world, they're building amazing things,
yeah,
but they also have this mentality of acting as a lab and trying out, you know, edgy kinds of
yeah,
efforts.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that you know, one of the ways of looking at their achievement is you know, the linkage with a lot of, arguably, for a lot of what you have been imagining. and pushing it towards building in quote unquote the real world, and yet at the same time it is dematerializing. I mean, for instance, um, none of those buildings would be even remotely, they're expensive enough as they are, but they wouldn't even be remotely affordable if they weren't using automobile technology at this point. And they wouldn't be, they wouldn't appear as fluid as Zaha imagined them appearing if it wasn't for the machine. And we are, I said to Helmut, I suggested to Helmut, and I talk to my students this way as well, that we are at this point manipulating the products of corporations when we're talking about building in the real world. And we almost have to rely, architects at the limit, and even architects at the mediocre, architects immersed in building almost anything. Contractors, I also lectured in the construction department at City College of San Francisco. We are manipulating products that we receive from corporations. So at the limit of architecture, we are pushing those corporations to integrate with the innovations that have occurred in automobile technology, to start to bring our imaginations truly, the limits of our imaginations truly into the real world. And yet I think that there is almost a dematerialization of the real world that's occurring, which circles back to a lot of the great research you're doing in terms of augmented reality, in terms of multidimensional reality. And it seems to me that we are unraveling it in that sense, with all the good and bad that proposes.
It's already been 3 decades. I mean, it's amazing to think of since liquid architectures. But that's what it meant, already back then. I mean, first of all, there was a plural, that it wasn't architecture, it was architectures always, and trans architectures. Like there's this notion of the multiplicity. And then the idea of the liquid, which was many things, because the liquid is, we're liquid, like all sorts of things are liquid as a conceptual category. But it's also the variable, so all the things that are parametric and the rest, I mean, that was kind of contained in there. Now, here's the thing, in sort of our popular culture, Elon Musk is quite famous and successful at doing many things because, by his own account, he and his group go back to first principles. We have this idea of first principles. And the question becomes, what are the first principles of architecture? Like if you didn't do architecture from, well, I'm gonna be a spider web and I'm gonna wait for clients, and I'm going to do whatever they say, or I'm going to eat them,
Yeah.
or they're going to eat me, or it's like this sort of, let's wait and see what comes in and let's decide what to do. That basically the problem comes with the client or the developer. And you say, well, what is architecture from its first principles? Well, you would have to say various things, and one of them would be that it has something to do with space and inhabiting space. And in, like how we occupy it. And there's this word inhabit, which has to do with habit, which we may wind up coming back to. So let me flag habit. So you would have to say, as now Kopp Himmelblau said, about what architecture is, you would have to say that architecture is about space. If space changes, architecture must change. They said architecture must burn, so then the question is, how has human occupation of space changed? Consequently, how must architecture change? And this zoom is an alteration of spatial and habitation. We're doing something spatial that is not local. Right? I mean, we're in a space, but that space is neither where you are nor where I am. And I'm not even where I am in terms of my background. And you're wherever your mind is,
My mind
And
seems
this is a new
background. So that's fantastic.
okay. So what that means is that we have to find a corresponding architecture that is not the rooms we're in, and it's not just the screens we're in. It's actually this new condition. Now, if we begin to
Nice. Yeah.
enumerate the changes of space, just the fact that my cell phone works and it has GPS and it has, all the kinds of things that it has. And even, since Marconi, that radio signals work and they go through walls. But to a radio signal, walls don't exist. We don't exist. We
Nice.
are
Yeah.
invisible. We are ghosts
Right.
in that space. All of these things have existed for over a century, and they're rapidly changing. And they've been begging for architectural expression, except that most architects have said, well, bricks, you know, and someone says, well, this other thing, not wood, you know, nothing wrong with bricks and wood and stone and all of that, but there's this new condition. Now, where it gets really fun is that we're like this far away from Apple or someone, probably Apple, releasing XR glasses, which are extended reality, augmented reality, where you're going to have the fabricated and the virtual and the augmented all coinciding so that I see a building. The building might actually have sensors and might be interactive and responsive, and it might be surrounded by all sorts of other things. And the sum of its sensor space and its augmented space and its interactive space and its actual space will be connected to the cloud. And from the cloud, will go down to Tokyo or somewhere else or everywhere else. And that entire span is now an architectural problem if architects will only take it on. And I think increasingly, like over the
That's
last
great.
several years, more and more people have been embracing it. And especially more and more young people kind of know it inherently because they live there, So they go to architecture school and they want to do something that is more congruent with their own spatial expression, which is actually all over the place.
Well, to extend that a bit, you could build. I was reminded. I think I mentioned this to Helmut too. He didn't read the book. Shishin Lu, Three Body Problem. I don't know if you had a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you could have the everything's a sphere, for argument's
Mm-hmm.
sake. Inside the sphere, you turn on your house. Your houses are
Mm-hmm.
places of imagination. I think that is going to happen. I think that we are going there. And that's one
Mm-hmm.
side of this. The other side is materials, architectural production materials that are sweeping over the construction industry like a tidal wave are
Mm-hmm.
are increasingly, and you could argue that
Increasingly, sorry, yeah, I missed the word. Increasingly
synthetic,
synthetic.
in,
Yes, okay.
increasingly, human made, human imagined, even
Mm-hmm.
at the molecular level. There
Right.
is there are so we are remaking reality right in front of
Mm-hmm.
us, and that is going to be it's already been happening for arguably hundreds of years, but the foods we eat, it has been happening where we are, bananas used to be little, that type of thing, but
And there
we
used to be more of them, though, because I
that's
think we're making one kind of banana really
yeah,
big,
right.
and all the rest are vanishing.
Right, but I think this, part of, there are different starting points for the agricultural revolution. I mean, no one really knows. It's as recent as 10,000 years, as distant as 50,000, and and you could argue that technology. Where does technology start for humanity? Does it start when we carve a stone? Does it start when we stopped and created the first obelisks to contemplate the stars? When technology appears somewhere when we left being a hunter gatherer, or might have been when we made our first shelter and got out of the caves. And so that technology, um, right now, of course, in the last 50 years, has completely gone vertical, and it is moving very, very fast, for argument's sake. And I say with some concern, providing we survive Vladimir Putin. But yeah, but and there are architects that may be imagining. I've imagined what if there was a Ukraine that could completely survive any threat from Russia, and that Ukraine might be integrated. It's already happening with buildings that are reinforced but are letting the landscape go over them. So we're burrowing into the ground more and letting nature take over. But we could also sustain any threats from significantly destructive weaponry, etc. So I think that I guess the question that I would ask to extend some of your comments here is this idea of using the coming full integration of augmented reality, virtual reality, and what we consider the built world could conceivably allow for vast experimentation, not only in terms of the mind, of spaces that were better than any acid trip, better than any hallucinogenic, but also governmental systems. Also, how to protect, how to completely this infinite metaverse can be a source of significant improvement. It's got a dark side too, but it could be significantly encourage the continuing ramping up of technology. And so I'd ask you for your feelings about that, but also, how do you see the role of an architect? How do you see your life's achievements in terms of your leadership and in what's becoming such a dominant mode of expression in our
I think that's a superb and really, really important question. And since we began with a kind of reminiscence of architecture school, I think we can remember, and I think it's still true, that when you go to architecture school, well, you might have some ideas about what architecture is, but not really. And what it is to design it yourself, well, not really. It depends on people's backgrounds. Some people grew up in architecture families and know more. Some people just love the idea and didn't know what it was. And generally, the first problems, there are some abstract problems like basic design, and then eventually you're asked to design we were asked to design, a house for your mother or something like that, right? Something familiar. And so you start with one's own desires, and then you grow into looking at the site, and maybe you have now a neighborhood, and maybe you design a little building in a city center at an intersection, something of the kind. And then the problems get more and more elaborate, and the theory comes in, and you have formal ideas, and then it gets all to all sorts of more advanced levels. Now, as you do that, you can become enamored of the object. Like I want to make a beautiful house for myself, or a beautiful villa, or a beautiful museum, or maybe I'll make an airport, or something, like all these things. And you see it now in when it was print media, you saw it in the glossy pictures, and now you see it on websites. You see the picture of the design. The trouble is that even the most brilliant pictures of individual designs, when you put them side by side, you go visit the site, they actually are incoherent. They actually are disrespectful of one another. They don't respond to the past, and they don't even respond to the present. And they don't usually last very long, because they're not made of materials that can last through time. So that's a kind of framing of and there are other framings, right? I don't mean to be absolute, but this is a framing of a kind of growing awareness in architecture for a student who kind of is coming up and doing these things. And then you get to the virtual and the parametric and the computational. Now that's part one. Part two uh, through cosmic accidents, uh, I'm Greek, and I happened to grow up in Athens, and I was taken to the Parthenon, to the Acropolis of the Parthenon, several times as a kid, and
Amazing.
then I
Yeah.
went back, many other times.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, it was just ancient. It was just like old and interesting, but it was almost like alien. You might as well have told me that people from Mars did this. Then over time, it
They
became
did
clear that,
apparently.
yeah,
Nice.
well, over time, you realize that, well, maybe they were more like us, and then when you start reading Plato and Aristotle and all of that, you realize that they're actually incredibly contemporary and probably
Yes.
smarter than we are
Yes.
in the civility and sharpness of their conversation. I mean, they're just really on top of things, and they're also very polite and considerate, and all sorts of really impressive things that you don't suspect until you actually get into how they're treating things. Okay, so there's all of that, and as you go, you realize that the Parthenon costs them. I can forget the proportion. It costs them something like 40 to 60% of their military budget.
Wow. Billions of
Now
dollars.
imagine
Hundreds of
if we
billions of
spent
dollars.
40 to 60% of our budget on one building,
Yeah.
right? And it was made of marble, which was not easy to work with, and it was made to an incredible precision, not only for then but for now. And it's they're not even regular pieces. Like every single piece is slightly tilted or adjusted for all sorts of other reasons,
Yeah.
which means everything had to be computed. And clearly, the thing has lasted for 2,500 years, and clearly the identity of certainly an entire country is kind of hanging on it. But arguably, since Alberti and this single church in Rimini, uh, San Francesco, uh, which is the first uh, classically inspired building in 1100 years. There's this one building. There is no neoclassical architecture, and then this building shows up.
Yeah.
And by now, there are neoclassical buildings everywhere, like on every country that I've ever been to.
Hmm.
There has been this language. All right, now here's the thing. The people who built that knew that it was much bigger than their lifespan. They couldn't possibly have built it for themselves, right? I mean, the expenditure was too big, the material was too lasting, the precision and the mathematics and the thought and the connection to philosophy was too profound. I mean, they didn't do it for their own sake. So what were they doing? And here's where architecture becomes really important and really interesting. And it's not just the Parthenon. I think every landmark architecture in every culture is doing the same thing. Architecture is a communication to the future. It's a culture trying to inscribe in form its values, its meanings, what it means to be civilized, what it means to be discerning. They're putting in a material record that even a child can see with no language and no schooling. You just go and see the thing, and it already makes an impression on you.
Nice.
And if you dig into it, it's endless. The more you look, the more you find. And they know this, and they code, it's like a message in a bottle for millennia, right? That's its purpose. And so when you get to the role of the architect, in the beginning, you go to school and you think you're making a building for your mom or for yourself, and it's pretty and it's cool, or you're making a really splendid villa for a client or a nice housing development. But now we're getting into, well, who's paying and who's collecting the rent? The motives get all mixed up. You think you're doing these things, and you think you're doing it to be successful and to be a star architect, or just a successful architect who's living reasonably well with one's family and one's friends, all these things. But what seems to have escaped us is that the role of the architect is to make a city, to make citizens, to make a civilization. We don't do it by ourselves. right? But you start with a building on a site, and if you have any kind of awareness and you look at European cities or other cities, historical cities usually, you realize that the building it makes a large room. It cooperates with its neighbors and makes a plaza, and the plaza is a room for everybody. And if you have several of these, the city is beautiful. What we do is we go to these places as tourists. We admire them. We pay airfare. We have carbon footprints to go and see them for a couple of days. It doesn't seem to occur to us to come home and do that at home with our cities, which is really bizarre. Like, I've spent a lot of time driving on the freeway. And if you have an architectural sort of awareness of things, you realize that the section of a freeway is kind of like that, or maybe two of these little U shapes, and they go on forever. And they're like enormous, horrible rooms that obscure the landscape. Like, why it is that freeways need to be ugly is unforgivable. Like, we rationalize it through, well, it's inexpensive. We have to be efficient. We can't afford it. And then we live years in ugliness.
Mm-hmm.
And consequently, I don't want to say it too harshly, but we become uglier people, meaning that we become less discerning. We become more tolerant of ugliness.
That's beautifully said, Marcos. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Plato and the ancients. And in my understanding, in response again and extending what you're saying a little bit, in my understanding of Plato and Aristotle, over the years it seemed to be reinforced the more reading I did on these. And I know in prior discussions I've had with you, you have read Plato and Aristotle in Greek, which is the complete. And we could talk about that too in terms of the limitations of language, and even in terms of the imagination of architecture. But let me just say that I've understood, and it seems to have been reinforced in my reading, Plato as the father of rational, and the forms, ideal geometry, and you could correct me in a few minutes to the extent to your desire. But Aristotle, I loved when I was at Columbia, when I was a student, when I got my first understanding of Aristotle as the father of empiricism and science. And I felt that Aristotle reacted to his teacher and basically took almost an opposite road. He was almost given license to do that. There's tremendous respect in Aristotle's writing for Plato, of course, but this idea of looking at what is around us and analyzing only what is around us, gaining meaning from the scientific analysis of quote unquote reality, as opposed to positing something in the sky. That Plato's one way of understanding that I understood Plato was the uncovering of these ideal forms. And when you look at ancient Greek architecture, and I know that a lot of this was happening at the same time. Philosophical precepts were being set at the same time as Pestum was being constructed. I mean, it's remarkable actually that it's not one or the other; it's kind of unified. You start to see Platonic form dominating. And let me just say my other understanding or misunderstanding, using Eisenman's dictum of misreading. So my misreading of ancient philosophy is again, Heraclitus was positing chaos theory. There was, and it seems to have been fully suppressed ultimately in a
Fully suppressed.
And again, we read, as you had said, as I study more and more ancient philosophy, I was like, oh my God, these people are easily smart as we are. There has not been a certain kind of evolution. We have evolved technologically. We have not necessarily evolved intellectually. Our brains probably stopped evolving, maybe with Elon Musk's Neuralink, we're gonna be able to push ahead. So what seems to be happening with the digital, though, is the release of Heraclitus. and in combination with a kind of celebration of empiricism. And I think that there's a certain kind of and I'm talking at the limits, but it would almost appear that there's been a tremendous fear of releasing the reality, quote unquote, which is the fact that we are nothing but a geological layer, with the fact that nothing will really last, with the fact that there we are moving through, the cosmos at 22, million miles a second, on a twirling on a planet that's moving fast. And we're getting, as science and technology advance, we're able to take off the blinders, and we start to see what Heraclitus may have been gesturing towards, and what it means to not have identical forms. And yet, one more comment is that the world of the digital appears to be fully rational. It's actually in the realm of what Plato might imagine. So we just seem at a very stressed time in that area. I'm not, it's almost like there's a justification to a certain extent of what Plato was imagining, because we are going into the ideal world, but it's filled with empiricism. Maybe it's everything all at once. I'm not sure. That was a recent movie.
I think that part is probably the better way to look at it. That it's probably in its own way all true, and when you look at when you've actually read all the major things that Plato did, and then the same with Aristotle, and then the same with Epicurus. There isn't that much, but you have Lucretius, the atomists, and so on, and then all the other people. You realize that they have disagreements, but they're more respectful of each other, and in the end, they arrive at things that don't really cancel each other. They actually can coexist.
Right.
But all of this has been presented to us through many filters of many centuries. And one super important filter to understand is that both Aristotle and Plato and Epicurus and Lucretius and all of those ancient philosophers, they're ancient in the sense that they were polytheists who were then either canceled or reinforced by monotheists, meaning that all sorts of really weird intellectual gymnastics had to go into that. And regarding monotheism, let me make this really clear. When I say monotheism, I don't necessarily mean the religions. I mean any kind of mono-respect. So to me, if you have a culture that only respects money, that's a kind of monotheism.
Right.
And if you had a culture that respected any other thing, like let's say I really like salmon, so I'm going to create a culture that, has, salmon as the best food. That's a sure way to get everyone to be, yeah, but everyone is going to be malnourished even if they only eat salmon. There is no such thing as any one thing. Now, the thing is that we've had centuries of this kind of mono intolerance. And all these things we're talking about, they come from a polytolerance. Now, we don't have to get into whether gods exist, but we can say that the mountain people have some respect for mountain things, and the sea people have some respect for sea things, and all the other kinds of people have respect for things according to where they are. And a civilized person is probably civilized in direct proportion to how they multiply their respect. So I would say, instead of polytheism, I would just say polyrespect. And that way I can go to any culture and see what they respect and learn to respect it. Okay. Now, all of that gets confused in the passage of time. And so we don't get Plato as Plato meant it, and we don't get Aristotle as Aristotle meant it, and we don't get... Now, at the very beginning of your point, and let me know if I'm going on too long, because it's a kind of complicated answer. In the very beginning of it, you find that one of the criticisms of Aristotle toward Plato and before is that Plato and before used the process called diaeresis, in English diaresis or something like that, meaning basically division. And what did that mean? It meant, well, if we're going to be discussing something about the day and we're interested in night and day, then it has two parts, and we won't be done until we talk about both night and day. If we're talking about work, let's say in 8-hour shifts, then there are 3 possible 8-hour shifts, and our conversation won't be over until we've actually touched on all of them. So, and for whatever topic they looked at, they had this notion of what is the whole of the topic and what is our division of it. And that's one way in which the dialogues and all of those things have this fullness, because they're consciously saying, what are all the partitions, and are we sure to touch upon all of them? And it could be 2, it could be 3, it could be 5, it could be 12, like the year, but they don't forget. They're not going to talk about the year and forget about summer. All right. And Aristotle comes along and he says, yes, that's good, but you can't claim to know something unless you know both the parts and the reasons for the parts.
Nice. Yeah.
And that's where he starts looking at things. And he does the taxonomy. I mean, most of our science is actually the titles of the writings of Aristotle. Right. I mean, he kind of lays out the whole thing, the whole thing. And then he goes in and for each one tries, to the best of his knowledge, he tries to explain everything. Now, when that system gets destroyed in my eyes, the sort of ancient system gets crushed by this newfound miracle-based monomania, Plato is brought back for a while.
That's right.
Right? Because then Aristotle is kind of contorted.
Yes.
And Plato is lost.
Right.
And then it takes until the fall of Constantinople for Plato to be reintroduced in Greek to Florence and translated. And then all of Europe learns Greek. And Aldus Manutius creates the first press with Gutenberg, like talk about good fortune and winning the lottery, Gutenberg invents the printing press just as Greek returns, and Aldus Manutius sets up the first publishing house, and for the first time in 1100 years, publishes ancient Greek texts in Greek, while all the royal houses have decided that they need to learn Greek and they need to start universities, and that spreads around the world. Now, by the time you get to us, there are people like Penrose, who just won the Nobel Prize, and people like Max Tegmark, and they are in their own writings. They are Platonists. So do I have? Let me do this little thing. I'll try to do it quickly. But now,
I didn't know that actually. Roger Penrose, a Platonist. Quantum, quantum gravity, hard problem of consciousness exists within the quantum. That's Roger Penrose. And I suppose
well, let me explain in what way, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that Aristotle is known for are the 4 causes. The 4 causes are that if you look at anything, here's a cup, right? There's a formal cause, it's a cup. There's a material cause, it's ceramic. There's an efficient cause, a potter made it. And there's a final cause that it's made to drink from. So that's one notion of the formal. And here the word formal is more Platonic. Like it belongs to the category of things called cups or tables or the Platonic ideas. But in architecture, when we say, what's your formal idea? We don't mean that. We mean, what's your figure-ground relationship? What's your partie? How are you going to interlace brick to create a certain kind of pattern? In your parametric system, are you making it with these kinds of curves or those kinds of curves? So that's a formal at the material level. And because of these many centuries of translation and mistranslation and all of that that's happening, we're not clear about which one we're meaning. We have a theory of the Big Bang. And then we have all sorts of science about how the Big Bang went through and made clusters, and the clusters became galaxies and then condensed into planets and suns and, all the way down to the molecules of my coffee. We can do that.
Yeah.
but we're not so good at answering why there should be mathematics at all. Like, why there should be any kind of regularity. Here we have this thing that I said. There's one kind of form. Plato winds up being on the size of why should anything actually behave itself? Why should there be any regularity? Why is there ultimately mathematics? You know, and on the other side is like, well, how do I fabricate a cup? And we actually have to kind of understand that they're inseparable. There is no theory of the universe that that cannot contend with matter or whatever it is, but there will be no complete theory of the universe that doesn't explain why it should exist at all and why it should have any kind of regularity and pattern, uh, any kind of behavior that is predictable. But obviously it does. So you can never eradicate Plato. He's always going to be there.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Although I'm also reminded, when you were talking about highways, it brought up some thinking about Deleuze and Guattari and nomenology, and this idea of releasing over time, and perhaps again, if architecture is a kind of zeitgeist in effect, that are the movement, the compulsion for movement that appears to be in the human species, entropy appears to be, if we are the highest form of consciousness, at least on this planet, then we are compelled to move and to move fast. And everything in our known universe appears to actually comply to that. Everything is moving fast. And our consciousness, which was under an illusion of stasis, the highways, to me, that's nomenology in practice. I mean, these are vectors and vectors of movement, and they are vectors of movement that cut through everything. And we seem to be compelled to open. Maybe we should just talk about the architects. And there is, of course, resistance from, at one end you may call it fascism, but there is a tremendous resistance to movement in the human species, which is based on fear, paranoia, I think a lot of negative components. Most of what is positive about the human species appears to be oriented towards movement. And in a sense, the one comment about positive comment about highways, of course, it's in American mythology. Is you get in your car and you move, and something I like traveling in my car to Seattle, and you just go on the highway and you're kind of looking at things. I can, turn on podcasts in my car. So that idea of nomenology actually does have an architecture, and the architecture may be as fluid as what you're demonstrating in the background behind you. That is in a way where we are going, and it seems almost irreversible, and dangerous, because part of it does include all the technology that goes with it. But I don't know if that means that. Well, again, how we view Plato, he gets abused consistently through time, and the resistance to that movement is it a nuclear weapon? Is it self-destruction? And I've read recently that the means of destruction, the dystopia, appears to travel right along with utopia. Again, in terms of this binding of the human condition. But maybe I know we're a little past our 1 hour, and I'd welcome talking to you for half the day, no problem. But I guess in conclusion, I mean, do you at least for this podcast, how do you feel about that movement of humanity towards speed? Do you think that is, and maybe a few comments on nomenology, and it's almost like part of the way to perceive a lot of advanced digital work is kind of grabbing a hold of chaos, in whatever way we can, but allowing a little more of it into the system, so to speak. I wonder if you have any comments on that in closing.
Yeah, you're bringing up well, with chaos and all of these things, and also Deleuze and Guattari, and the layer of consistency and the layer of development, and all these things that they do. Um, I'll try to say this in brief. There's a fundamental understanding that one needs to develop that is most easily explained through thermodynamics and entropy, but in a phrase might be collapsed into the unique and the rare. And what it means is that every grain of sand on a beach is unique. When someone says to you, you're unique or your work is unique, they're really saying nothing, because even if they mean it as a compliment, which you can accept as a compliment, the information content is really nothing because everything is unique. But some things are rare. And rare means that, okay, we see all these planets, but as far as we can see, we're the only planet that has life on it. There are many, we're all made of chemicals, a certain amount of calcium, a certain amount of iron, a certain amount of this and that and the other. And if you were to put us in containers, we would all pretty much be the same. So and those would be unique. But the particular one that is you with whom I am having a conversation is rare. And so it's not just a matter of speed, and it's not just a matter of development. The real task is to recognize, and then if you're a creative person, be able to produce the rare, to understand that all the configurations are unique, but some are rare, some are harder to attain. And the rare, if you actually look at the sort of thermodynamics of entropy and the mathematics of entropy, it's explained with a bell curve, right? With most things being in the middle and a few things being at the tail end one way and a few things at the tail end at the other end. And so the rare can be the rare that is terrible, which hopefully you know to avoid. And then there's the rare that is increasingly positive by some criterion, but is literally objectively, statistically different. So it's not just subjective. And in the end, this thing that we call rare winds up being what we call balance, wisdom, beauty. To me, beauty is the rarest of the rare because it is the wise that is rare. To me, that is the goal. I mean, that's the goal for me as a living creature, for me as an educator, for me as a maker, for the fields, whether it's architecture or trans architecture or all the strange things that we do, however many dimensions we move into, however virtual it all becomes. The real question is, how can I get to a more rare incarnation, like this background that I've made? That's made with widely available software, something called Midjourney. And if you don't have a sense of the rare and you just start typing things at random, it basically gives you back stereotypes, either its own or whatever was fed into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to have this notion of nudging this thing. I mentioned a cloud of probability, of nudging this thing to more and more unlikely places until finally, you get the rare, which is presumably also on the positive side of the rare. What would the positive be? Well, for a living creature, it's the enhancement of life. That you wouldn't do anything destructive of life. For a civilized creature, is the enhancement of civilization. You wouldn't do anything uncivilized. Like the idea of, I come from Greece, I love Greece, but a whole generation of people has decided that one form of political expression is graffiti on monuments. Well, political expression is good, but a gesture that takes 3 seconds that mars something that took years or thousands of years to make isn't civilized.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we learn that and we teach that, and architecture teaches it to a whole city, even to children who may yet not have language, as music does. We learn to distinguish finer and finer pattern from noise. So it's all a kind of thermodynamic thing, but we have to bring it back to our understanding and our practice and the things that we actually make, and the way in which we evaluate what we should respect everyone and everything. We should respect the unique, but we should treasure the rare.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you, Marcos. Yeah, that was wonderful 1 hour or so meditation with you. um,
Well, yeah, great questions, fun conversation. I hope my answers weren't too long, but you
no,
can edit it down.
there was some
You,
wonderful things said. I don't think I'm going to edit any of it down other than the beginning. You know,
okay.
so you'll see the start before while I was setting up and be seen, I suppose. But that's probably around 5 minutes. But this was wonderful. Certainly hope we can do it again soon. And
I hope so. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the initiative, and I hope I'm sure you're going to invite really interesting viewpoints, and your questions are already laden with all sorts of stuff. I mean, they're interesting questions, so you're evoking just the right thing at the right time. So thanks
thank
a
you.
lot.
And having spent an hour with you, I'm inspired. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah,
Take care.
have a wonderful day. And I'll stop recording now.